If you ever want to see how fast power really shifts, just watch what happens when someone pulls the plug on the wrong house. The ICU monitor started screaming before the lights even went out. A sharp, high-pitched alarm that cut straight through my chest as the room dropped into a heavy, suffocating silence. The kind where even your own breathing sounds too loud, too desperate. And then came the smell, faint but unmistakable, warm plastic and ozone as the machine struggled to hold on. My daughter's oxygen unit flickering like it was fighting for its last breath. And I could feel my pulse in my teeth, counting every second like it actually mattered, because it did, every second did. And through the dim hallway light I heard it, the slow, deliberate click of heels on concrete, steady, confident, like she owned the ground she walked on. Margaret Whitmore didn't rush. She never rushed. She stepped into view with that same polished smile she used at every HOA meeting, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of authority. And she didn't even look at the machines first. She looked at me, like this was personal, like this was a lesson she'd been waiting to teach. "That's what happens when you ignore community standards," she said, voice smooth, almost sweet. But there was nothing sweet about the way the room felt. The air thick and electric, the silence between each machine beep stretching longer than it should, and I remember noticing the smallest things. The way her perfume couldn't quite cover the sterile hospital smell. The way her fingers tightened just slightly around that clipboard. Like she was enjoying this, like she believed she was in control, and maybe she thought she was. Maybe she thought a shut-off notice and a few phone calls to the utility company made her untouchable. But she didn't understand what she had just done. Not really, because I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even step toward her. I just stood there, listening to the fading rhythm of the machines, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. And then I checked my watch, slow, deliberate, the way you do when you already know exactly how this ends. And I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up my hands in that dim, failing room, and I made one call, just one, calm, quiet, no panic in my voice at all. "Activate medical priority override," I said, and for the first time since she walked in, Margaret's smile flickered, just for a second, like something didn't line up in her perfect little world. And that was the moment I knew. She still thought this was about HOA rules. She still thought she controlled the power, and she had no idea what was already on its way down her street. Margaret Whitmore let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they think they have already won, and she shifted her weight like she was settling in to watch the outcome. But the room did not stay quiet for long, because somewhere in the distance I heard it first, a low vibration that did not belong to this neighborhood, not to these manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, a deep mechanical rumble that grew louder with every second. And I saw her eyes flick for just a moment toward the window, that tiny crack in her confidence widening as the sound built into something undeniable. Diesel engines, multiple, heavy, coordinated, and then the streetlights outside flickered once, twice, before snapping off completely. Not just my house, her house, the entire block, darkness swallowing everything she thought she controlled. And now the silence she created was gone, replaced by something bigger, louder, official, the kind of sound you do not ignore because it does not ask permission. It takes over, and I could feel the shift in the air as the oxygen unit behind me struggled for one last second before a new current surged through the line. A steady hum returning, stronger, cleaner, controlled, and the monitor stabilized with a sharp, steady rhythm that cut through the chaos like a promise. And I exhaled for the first time since the lights went out, slow and measured, because I knew exactly what had just connected. But Margaret did not. Not yet. She stepped closer to the window now, her heels no longer clicking with confidence, but tapping faster, uneven, like she was trying to catch up to something she could not understand. And when she pulled the curtain back, the glow hit her face from outside. Not the soft yellow of streetlights, but harsh white industrial beams cutting across her perfect street. 3 generator trucks lined up like they owned the place, thick cables running across asphalt she used to patrol like a queen. Uniformed crews moving with precision, no hesitation, no discussion, just execution. And that was when she turned back to me, the color in her face gone, her clipboard lowering an inch like it suddenly weighed too much. "What did you do?" she asked, not sharp anymore, not sweet, just uncertain, and I could hear it. That small fracture in her voice where authority used to be, and I did not raise mine to match it. I kept It level, calm, the same way it had been from the start, because this was never about emotion. It was about systems, about knowing which switch actually mattered. I did not do anything, I said, glancing at the monitor now steady behind me. I just made the right call, and outside the engines continued to roar, drowning out whatever control she thought she had left, and for the first time since she stepped onto my property. Margaret Whitmore looked like someone who finally understood she had just stepped into something far bigger than an HOA violation. Margaret took a step back like the room itself had shifted under her feet, her eyes darting between the window and the steady glow of the machines behind me, trying to piece together something that made sense in her world, but nothing about this fit her rules, not her bylaws, not her neat little authority built on paper and fines and polite threats. And outside the engines did not stop. They settled into a deep, constant hum that you could feel in your chest, like the street itself had been rewired. And then came the second wave, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, a pair of utility vehicles pulling up behind the generators, logos she probably had never noticed before, men in reflective jackets stepping out with clipboards that actually meant something, radios clipped to their shoulders, voices low and efficient as they checked lines and meters like this was routine, like taking over an entire block was just another Tuesday, and Margaret followed the light with her eyes again, her lips parting slightly as she watched one of them walk straight past her decorative stone entrance sign without even slowing down, ignoring the symbol she treated like a gate to a kingdom, and I could see it in her face now, the realization, starting to take shape, not full understanding yet, but enough to feel it slipping. That control she thought she had, it was not just challenged, it was irrelevant, and she turned back to me again, slower this time, like she was measuring every movement. You cannot just override a private community grid, she said, trying to pull her voice back together, trying to sound like the person who walked in here minutes ago. But it did not land the same. It sounded thinner, uncertain, and I glanced at the hallway where the light had fully stabilized now, clean and bright like nothing had ever happened, the oxygen unit running smooth, the monitor steady and calm, each beep now spaced exactly the way it should be, and I let that sound sit between us for a second before I answered, because that sound mattered more than anything she could say. This is not a private grid anymore, I told her, and outside one of the crew members lifted a cone and set it right at the entrance of her street. A simple orange marker that might as well have been a line she could not cross. Another truck pulling in behind it, blocking access completely, and I saw her follow that too, her shoulders tightening, her fingers gripping the edge of her clipboard now instead of holding it with ease. You shut down power to a registered medical critical site. I continued, my voice still level, still calm. That triggers a priority response you cannot stop. And there it was, the full break, her composure, cracking just enough to show what was underneath, not anger, not yet, but something closer to fear, the kind that comes when you realize the rules you rely on do not apply anymore. And for the first time since she stepped onto my driveway, Margaret Whitmore did not have an answer ready. She just stood there in the steady light, listening to the machines she almost silenced, and the engines outside that had already taken her street away from her. Margaret's eyes locked onto the orange cone at the end of her street like it had personally betrayed her, and for a moment she just stood there, frozen between the world she thought she controlled and the one unfolding right in front of her. And then she snapped back into motion, pulling her phone out with a sharp, practiced movement, fingers moving fast across the screen, the same way she probably sent violation notices and late fees. But this time there was something different in the way her hand trembled just slightly, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And I was, because I had seen that shift before. The moment someone realizes their authority has limits. This is Margaret Whitmore, president of the association, she said into the phone, voice tight, but trying to stay composed. I need to speak to your supervisor immediately. There are unauthorized vehicles blocking a private roadway. And she paused, listening, her eyes narrowing as the person on the other end spoke, and I could almost hear the tone without hearing the words. Calm, official, not impressed, and the silence stretched just long enough for her expression to change, not dramatically, just a subtle tightening around her mouth, a flicker of disbelief that she could not quite hide. No, you do not understand. She pushed, stepping toward the door now, like proximity might restore her control. This is a residential community. You cannot just. And then she stopped, mid-sentence, her voice cutting off like someone had flipped a switch inside her. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not have the next line ready. She just listened, her posture stiffening as whatever she was hearing sank in deeper than she expected. And I watched the moment land, watched the weight of it settle into her shoulders, the clipboard lowering further, her grip loosening as the reality replaced whatever script she had prepared, and outside the hum of the generators remained steady, unwavering, a constant reminder that this situation was no longer negotiable. One of the crew members walking past again with a tablet, checking readings like the entire block was now part of something larger, something structured, something governed by rules she did not write. And when Margaret finally pulled the phone away from her ear, she did not speak right away. She just stared at the screen for a second like it might give her a different answer if she looked long enough. And then she turned back to me, slower this time, her voice quieter, stripped of that polished edge. They said this address is flagged under emergency medical priority, she said, almost to herself, like repeating it might make it less real. And I nodded once, not as a victory, not as a challenge, just a confirmation of something that had already been set in motion long before she walked up my driveway. And she swallowed, her gaze drifting past me to the steady glow of the machines again, the rhythmic beeping filling the space between us. And I could see it clearly now, the understanding finally catching up, not just that she had made a mistake, but that she had crossed into something she could not undo, something documented, logged, and already moving through channels far beyond her reach. And outside another vehicle pulled up, this one marked differently, not loud, not aggressive, just official, parking with quiet authority as two more figures stepped out, scanning the scene with practiced eyes. And Margaret followed them with a look that was no longer confident, no longer certain, just searching, like she was trying to find a way back to the version of this story where she was still in control, but that version was already gone, replaced by the steady hum of systems she never knew existed until she tried to shut one of them down. The two figures who stepped out of that last vehicle did not rush. They did not raise their voices. They simply walked with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly where they stand in the chain of command. And that alone changed the atmosphere more than anything else that had happened so far, because even the crew already working outside shifted slightly, giving them space without being told, and Margaret noticed that too. I could see it in the way her posture straightened for a second, like she was preparing to reassert herself, reaching for that last piece of control she still believed she had. But it did not come back the same way, not this time. One of the men glanced at the address on his tablet, then at the power lines, then toward the open doorway where the steady light spilled out, and when his eyes landed on Margaret, there was no recognition there, no deference, just a quick assessment like she was part of the background. We are confirming the interruption originated from a manual shutoff request tied to this property, he said, voice even, professional, the kind that does not leave room for interpretation, and Margaret stepped forward immediately, seizing the moment. Yes, that was authorized by the association, she said, lifting her chin slightly, trying to rebuild that authority from the ground up. The homeowner is in violation of multiple community regulations regarding unauthorized equipment installation. And for a brief second, it almost sounded like her again, the version of her that walked into this situation convinced she was right. But the man did not respond the way she expected. He did not argue, did not react. He simply looked back at his tablet, tapped once, and nodded slightly as if something had been confirmed. Understood, he said. And that single word carried a weight she did not anticipate, because it did not agree with her. It categorized her. And I saw the moment it hit, the realization that she was no longer the one defining the situation. This location is registered under critical medical support designation, he continued, his voice steady over the low hum of the generators. Any disruption to power supply triggers automatic escalation protocols, and Margaret opened her mouth to respond. But nothing came out at first, just a brief pause where the pieces finally started to connect, the clipboard in her hand lowering completely now, her grip loosening as the edges of her certainty fell away, and outside the generators continued to run, their steady rhythm now sounding less like noise and more like structure, like something permanent, something that had already taken root in her street whether she liked it or not. There will be a formal review of the initiating request, the man added, glancing up from the screen, not threatening, not aggressive, just stating a process that was already in motion. And that was when Margaret's composure slipped for real, not in a dramatic way, not with raised voices or sudden movement, but in the quietest possible shift, her shoulders dropping just an inch, her eyes no longer scanning for control, but searching for understanding, and she looked at me again, not as an opponent this time, but as someone trying to reconcile what she thought she knew with what was actually happening. And I did not say anything. I just stood there in the steady light, listening to the machines behind me, the consistent beeping that meant everything was still working, everything was still holding. And for the first time since she stepped onto my driveway, Margaret Whitmore looked like someone who finally understood that this was never her system to control. She had just been allowed to believe it was until she tried to shut down the wrong one. Margaret did not speak right away, and that silence said more than anything she had said since she walked onto my driveway. Because for the first time, she was not trying to control the situation, she was trying to understand it. And outside, the generators kept running with that steady, grounded hum. Cables stretched across the pavement like veins feeding something larger than any one house. And one of the technicians adjusted a panel on the side of the truck, the click of switches and the low surge of power blending into a rhythm that felt permanent, stable, like this system had always been here, and she had just never noticed it. And I watched her eyes follow every movement now, not with judgment, not with authority, but with that quiet calculation people fall into when they realize the rules have changed without them. "How long does this stay active?" she finally asked, her voice lower, stripped of that polished edge she used to carry like armor. And I glanced toward the hallway, again where the light held steady, the monitor consistent, each beep clean and measured, the kind of sound that tells you everything is working exactly as it should, as long as it needs to. I said, simple, because that was the truth, and she let that sit for a moment, her gaze drifting back toward the street where her perfectly managed entrance was now marked off with cones and cables, her idea of order replaced by something far more precise. And I could see the next realization forming. Slower this time, heavier. And the review, she added carefully, like she was stepping into unfamiliar ground. What happens with that? And I could hear what she was really asking underneath it, not about process, but about consequence, about where this was going to land when everything stopped moving. And one of the officials outside spoke into his radio, short, clear phrases that carried through the open doorway, followed by a brief acknowledgement that crackled back. And I nodded slightly. Toward the street. "They document everything," I said, keeping my voice even. "The request, the timing, the impact," and I paused just long enough for the weight of that to settle before finishing, especially when it involves medical systems. And Margaret's grip tightened slightly on the edge of her clipboard again, not in control this time, but in something closer to grounding herself, like she needed something solid to hold on to while everything else shifted. And she looked past me once more at the equipment inside, the quiet machines doing their job without drama, without attention, just consistent, necessary function. And for a moment there was no calculation in her expression, no strategy, just a clear recognition of what she had interrupted, what she had almost silenced. And when she spoke again, it was softer than anything she had said before. "I did not know," she said. And it was not an excuse, not really. Just a statement that arrived too late to change anything. And I met her gaze without anger, without satisfaction, just steady. The same way I had been from the start, because this was never about proving her wrong. It was about making sure the system worked when it needed to, and outside the engines continued to run, the street no longer hers to manage, the process already moving forward whether she understood it or not. And in that steady, controlled light, Margaret Whitmore finally looked like someone who understood that what she called power had always been temporary, and what had just taken over her street was not. The street did not go back to normal, not even close, because once that kind of system takes over, it does not just disappear when the immediate problem is solved. It stays, it stabilizes, it makes sure nothing else breaks. And I could see that in the way the crews outside kept moving with quiet precision, checking connections, logging readings, confirming redundancies like they were building layers of certainty on top of something that had almost failed. And Margaret stood there watching all of it unfold, her world still recognizable, but no longer hers to direct. And after a long moment, she stepped outside, slow, careful, like she was entering a space she did not fully understand anymore. The gravel crunching under her heels sounding different now, sharper, louder against the steady hum of the generators, and I followed just far enough to stand in the doorway. The cool air from inside brushing against the warmer night air, carrying that faint mix of sterile equipment and diesel that now defined the entire block. And she looked up and down the street, past the identical houses, past the manicured lawns, to where the cables ran like temporary lifelines across everything she once organized into neat, predictable lines. And one of the technicians glanced at her briefly before returning to his work. No acknowledgement, no hesitation, just focus. And that was the difference. They were not here for her. They were not here for the association. They were here for something far more specific, far more important, and she knew it now. I could see it in the way her shoulders settled, not collapsing, just adjusting to a weight she had not carried before. And then one of the officials approached her, tablet in hand, posture straight, but not confrontational. "Ma'am, we will need to confirm a few details regarding the original shutoff request," he said, tone steady, procedural. And Margaret nodded automatically, the reflex of someone used to being in charge still there, but softened now, redirected. "Yes," she answered, her voice controlled but quieter. "I authorized it." And the words landed differently this time, not as a statement of power but as a point of record, something that would be written down, reviewed, and understood in a context she did not control. And the official tapped on his screen, noting it without reaction, without judgment, just adding it to a process already in motion. And I watched her as she stood there under the harsh white lights, no longer framed by her office, her meetings, or her carefully managed image, just a person in the middle of a system she could not influence. And the sound of the generators filled the gaps between every word, steady and unyielding, a reminder that what mattered had already been secured. And she glanced back toward me once more, not with defiance, not with that sharp, controlled smile, but with something closer to realization, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The only sound, the quiet rhythm of machines doing their job, and the distant radio chatter confirming everything was still stable. And in that silence the balance had fully shifted, not in a dramatic moment, not with raised voices or sudden action, but in a slow, undeniable way that left no room for interpretation, because what she had tried to control had already moved beyond her, and it was not coming back. By the time the first generator cycled down, the street no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a controlled site, every movement measured, every cable accounted for, and the transition was almost seamless, one system handing off to another without a single flicker inside my house. The lights steady, the machines consistent, the quiet rhythm of the monitor continuing like nothing had ever been interrupted. And that was the point. The whole system existed, so moments like that never left a mark. And Margaret stood near the edge of the driveway watching it happen, her arms now resting at her sides instead of holding that clipboard like a shield. And one of the technicians gave a short nod to another crew member before disconnecting a line, the thick cable lifting off the pavement with a soft scrape, coiling back into the truck like it had never been stretched across her street at all. And the cones came next, one by one, removed with the same efficiency they were placed, restoring access but not restoring control, because something had changed that could not be reset by clearing a roadway. And I stepped out a little further now, the night air cooler against my skin, the faint diesel scent fading as the engines powered down in sequence, each one leaving behind a silence that felt different than before, not empty, but settled, like everything had found its proper place again. And Margaret watched the last truck idle for a moment before it began to roll forward, slow and deliberate, passing her without pause, without acknowledgement, and I saw her eyes follow it all the way to the end of the street where it disappeared beyond the corner, taking with it the visible proof of what had just happened, but not the reality of it, because that was already documented, already processed, already moving forward somewhere she could not see. And when the final vehicle pulled away, the streetlights came back on one by one, a soft glow replacing the harsh white beams, returning the neighborhood to something familiar, something she recognized. But it did not feel the same, not to her, not anymore. And she turned slightly toward me, not fully, just enough to acknowledge my presence. And for a moment it looked like she might say something, something to reclaim the narrative, to explain, to justify, but whatever words she had did not come. They stayed somewhere behind that composed exterior, replaced instead by a quiet exhale that barely carried across the space between us, and I glanced back inside. The steady light spilling out across the threshold, the monitor continuing its calm, precise rhythm, each beep spaced exactly as it should be. And that sound grounded everything, reminded me what this was always about. And when I looked back at her, she was no longer standing like someone in charge of anything. Just someone who had witnessed a system she never knew existed until she tried to interfere with it. And the absence of noise now, the lack of engines and movement, only made that realization louder, because without all of it, there was nothing left to distract from the fact that what she had set in motion was not undone when the trucks left. It had only moved to the next stage, one she could not stop. And as the last echo of diesel faded from the air, Margaret Whitmore stood in the quiet street she used to control, finally understanding that control had never been hers to begin with. The night settled back into something quiet, but it was not the same quiet that existed before all of this. It carried a weight now, a kind of clarity that does not fade just because the noise is gone. And I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the steady rhythm inside the house, that clean, consistent sound that meant everything was stable, everything was exactly where it needed to be. And I turned back toward the doorway, the light from inside spilling out across the driveway like a boundary between two different worlds, one controlled by rules written on paper, the other by systems that do not ask permission. And Margaret remained where she was, just a few feet away, but it felt like a much greater distance now, not physical, but something deeper, something defined by what had just happened and what it meant going forward. And she looked down at her clipboard, still in her hand, but no longer held with purpose, just something she had not let go of yet. And after a long second she closed it slowly, the soft click sounding louder than it should, in the quiet street. And that was when I realized she was not looking for an argument anymore. She was looking for an ending she could understand. This will not just disappear, will it? She said, not looking at me at first, her eyes still on the pavement where the cables had been, faint marks left behind like a reminder of something that had passed through. And I shook my head slightly, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a fact. No, I said, keeping my voice even. It gets reviewed, documented, and it stays on record. And she nodded once, slow, like she already knew that but needed to hear it anyway, needed to place it somewhere real. And then she finally looked up at me, not with defiance, not with that sharp, controlled expression she carried before, but with something quieter, something more grounded. I thought I was enforcing order, she said, almost to herself, and I could hear the shift in that sentence. Not justification, not defense, just a realization that arrived too late to change anything. And I glanced back inside again, the steady light, the consistent hum, the quiet precision of everything working exactly as it should, and I let that answer for me before I spoke. Order is not control, I said, simple, because it did not need anything more than that. And the words settled between us without resistance, and she looked back down the street one more time. The houses identical again, the lights restored, everything appearing normal to anyone who had not witnessed what had happened, but she had, and that was enough. And after a moment she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet decision made without announcement, and began to walk back down the driveway, her steps slower now, measured in a different way, not with authority, but with understanding. And I watched her go until she reached the edge of the street, until she became just another figure under the soft glow of the streetlights. And then I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, the outside world fading into a distant quiet, replaced by the steady rhythm of the machines, the sound that had mattered from the beginning. And I stood there for a second, letting it fill the room, grounding everything. And in that calm, controlled light, one truth remained clear. Power does not announce itself, it does not argue, it does not demand attention, it simply holds, steady and precise, long after the people who thought they controlled it have walked away.